I bought a $2 million villa on the oceanfront, not as a trophy, not as a status symbol, but as a promise to myself that after decades of holding everyone else together, I would finally build something just for me. The salt wind brushed against the marble terrace, and for the first time in years, I felt the air wasn't just filling my lungs, it was cleansing them. I had walked through betrayals, through the constant demands of a family that never saw me as more than a resource, and through the quiet loneliness of a woman who gave too much. So when the keys hit my palm, it wasn't about the villa. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. Yet barely an hour after the papers were signed, the phone rang. His name flashed across the screen and my stomach twisted. My son-in-law. A man who had always spoken to me with polite arrogance, who measured respect by money and power. I almost didn't answer, but then I did. And the first words out of his mouth made the ocean behind me sound like a storm was about to rise. "Do you realize what you've just done?" His voice dripped with that smug confidence he always wore like a second skin, the kind that never faltered no matter how empty his own achievements were. I let him talk, not interrupting, just listening to the way his tone shifted from mock surprise to veiled hostility, as if my purchase of a villa was somehow an act of war against him. He started throwing numbers at me, reminding me of every so-called favor he and his wife, my daughter, had ever extended. A loan for a renovation 10 years ago. A business connection I supposedly wouldn't have had without him. Every word was meant to box me into a corner, to guilt me into believing that this villa was somehow his by extension. He didn't congratulate me, didn't even ask why I had chosen it or what it meant to me. His only concern was how fast he could get a piece of it. And as I stood barefoot on the balcony, my hand brushing against the cool stone rail, I realized he wasn't just shocked by my purchase. He was terrified. Because for the first time, he couldn't control me, couldn't predict me, couldn't profit off me. And when a man like him senses he's losing leverage, that's when the real fight begins. He launched into a performance I knew he had rehearsed long before this phone call. First came the guilt. "You know, Mom, if you just talked to us before making such a reckless decision, we could have guided you better. You're at an age where you shouldn't be handling these things alone." Then came the false concern, his voice softening, almost syrupy. "That kind of property is a big responsibility. Maybe you didn't think about maintenance, taxes, security. It could crush you." He spoke as though I were a child, fragile and easily swayed, forgetting I had built my life brick by brick without his hand in any of it. And then the mask slipped. He laughed, a short, cutting laugh that made my skin prickle, and said, "But don't worry. We'll take care of it for you. You can put it in our names. Avoid all that hassle. It'll be safer that way." Safer for whom? I thought. The ocean roared beneath me, waves colliding with the rocks like a warning drumbeat. My hand tightened around the phone. For years, I had allowed myself to be gaslit into thinking gratitude meant obedience, that family meant sacrifice without question. I remembered Christmas dinners, where he strutted like a king, undermining me in front of my own daughter, reminding everyone that his business deals kept the family comfortable. I remembered the day he used my savings for a temporary cash flow problem and promised to return it, only for the silence that followed to become permanent. I remembered how my daughter repeated his phrases, his opinions, as if they were her own, until I could hardly hear her voice anymore. And now, here he was, the ink barely dry on my new life, already reaching into it with greedy fingers. I didn't tell him no right away. That would have been too easy for him to twist to make me the hysterical one. Instead, I let him talk, let him reveal himself fully, and the longer he spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't about family, or love, or even respect. This was about power. He couldn't stand the idea that I had claimed something monumental without his approval, that I had stepped outside the shadow he had tried to keep me in. And as his words circled in my ear, sharp and insistent, I felt something inside me harden into resolve. He thought this villa was just real estate. He had no idea it was about to become the battlefield where I would finally reclaim every piece of myself they had taken. I let him ramble, pacing slowly along the terrace, the sea breeze lifting the hem of my dress, while his voice scratched in my ear like a persistent insect. He was so sure of himself, certain that within minutes I would cave, the way I had so many times before when he and my daughter presented their demands as if they were family obligations. I remembered the trips I paid for under the guise of family bonding, though somehow I was always the one footing the bill. I remembered the years when they borrowed my house for parties, turning my quiet garden into their stage. And when I asked for a small favor in return, something as simple as picking me up from the airport, there was always an excuse. My generosity had been their playground, and they thought the rules would never change. His voice grew sharper now, arrogance peeking through his faux concern. Do you even understand what a property like that is worth in 5 years? You're sitting on an investment you don't even know how to handle. You'll get eaten alive by sharks if you don't let us step in. You should sign it over before you make a mistake. I could almost see his smirk through the phone, that tight grin he wore whenever he thought he had cornered me. But instead of fear, I felt a wave of clarity wash over me. The truth was, I had been planning this villa for years, in silence. Every check I wrote, every investment I made, every penny I saved had been carefully calculated. While they wasted money on flashy cars, luxury trips, and empty displays, I had been quietly building something solid, something untouchable. And now that it stood before me, shimmering in the sun, it burned them to know they had no part in it. He tried another tactic, his voice suddenly dropping low, almost threatening. You know, Mom, if this gets out, the neighbors, the family, everyone will wonder why you didn't trust us. What will people think when they hear you made a purchase like this without consulting your daughter? It won't look good. Families don't keep secrets. I stopped walking, turned to face the endless ocean and let his words hang in the air. Families don't keep secrets? This, from the man who had drained my daughter's savings to cover his failed deal and lied about it for months? From the man who had kept hidden credit cards, who had whispered to her that I was out of touch every time I disagreed? He was projecting, as always, using fear to bend reality to his will. But not this time. This time I had leverage. This time I had proof of his behavior. The emails, the bank transfers, the silent witnesses who had watched me carry the weight he so carelessly dropped. And unlike him, I knew how to keep receipts. My heart beat steady, not frantic, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know exactly who I'm dealing with. He went quiet for a second, stunned, as if the script he always relied on had suddenly failed him. That silence was more satisfying than any insult I could have hurled. It was the sound of a man realizing his grip was slipping. And deep down, I knew this villa wasn't just mine. It was my line in the sand. From here on out, things would never be the same. He didn't like my composure. Men like him never do. They thrive on panic, on watching you stumble so they can swoop in and present themselves as saviors. When I didn't bite, he shifted again, his tone turning ice cold, almost businesslike. Listen, you're being emotional. You've always had a good heart, but you don't know how to manage things of this scale. Let's be realistic. You'll never survive the upkeep on that place. Do you even know what the property taxes are? The insurance? The monthly maintenance? This isn't some little cottage by the sea. This is $1 million property. It's not for you, not for me. The words landed heavy, but not the way he intended, because in that single phrase, he revealed everything. He didn't see me as capable, as worthy as someone who could stand on her own. He saw me as a resource to be managed, a pawn in his game. And he was furious that I had stepped off the board. I thought back to the countless times I had let him win small battles to keep the peace, letting him dictate holiday plans, letting him interrupt me in conversations, letting him decide how money was spent when I was the one paying. Each time I convinced myself it wasn't worth the fight. Each time I gave up a little more of myself. But standing there on the terrace, the villa's glass windows reflecting the endless horizon, I realized this was the fight that was worth everything. I told him calmly, "You've mistaken me for someone you can still manipulate. That ends today." His silence was quick, but then came the scoff, the sharp inhale, the audible disbelief. "You think you can stand against us? Against me?" The us stung, because I knew he meant my daughter too. My own flesh and blood, whose loyalty he had twisted to serve him. But even that couldn't weaken me anymore, because for once, I wasn't begging for their approval. I was declaring my independence. He began to raise his voice then, rattling off threats disguised as warnings. Lawsuits, family estrangement, rumors he could spread. He was throwing everything at me, hoping something would stick, hoping fear would finally choke my voice. But instead, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, his words didn't weigh me down. They rolled off like water, because the truth was simple. I had already survived worse. I had endured years of subtle erasure, of being treated as though I didn't matter. And now, with one property deed in my name, I had rewritten the story. He just didn't know it yet. His words rose in pitch, almost frantic now. as if he sensed the cracks forming in the wall he had built around me. "Fine," he snapped, "keep it. But don't come crying when you can't handle it. Don't expect us to bail you out when the bills start piling up. Don't expect us to be there when you're drowning." He was trying to make absence sound like punishment, not realizing absence was exactly what I had been craving. For years, I had prayed for peace, for silence, for space to breathe without being suffocated by their constant demands. And now, he was offering it like a threat, not knowing it was the very gift I had been waiting for. I let him finish his tirade, my eyes drifting toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, painting the water in streaks of gold and crimson. The villa's glass doors reflected that light back at me, as if the house itself were nodding in approval, reminding me why I had chosen it, because it symbolized a life no one else could claim, a place where my name alone held weight. When I finally answered, my voice was steady, almost gentle, but unshakable. "I won't need you to bail me out." I never did. I was the one bailing you out all these years, and you know it. The silence that followed was thick, charged, the kind of silence that only truth can create. I could almost picture his face twisting, his jaw tightening as he tried to calculate a response that wouldn't give away his panic. For a man so obsessed with control, being reminded of the ledger, of the countless times I had carried his weight, was unbearable. He muttered something about loyalty, about family, about how I was being dramatic. That word dramatic nearly made me laugh. Because for years, I had been the quiet one, the appeaser, the woman who swallowed her feelings to keep harmony alive. And now, the moment I dared to claim something for myself, suddenly I was dramatic. No, I thought, dramatic is what you call a woman who refuses to play small anymore. Dramatic is what you call her when she stops letting you write her script. I hung up before he could say another word, not in anger but in power. For the first time, I understood that the most profound act of revenge isn't screaming or proving or defending. It's removing access, and that's exactly what I intended to do. That night, after the call ended, I walked barefoot through every room of the villa. The echo of my steps on the polished marble floors was both haunting and liberating, like the house itself was learning my rhythm. Each corner carried promise. The kitchen where I would cook without anyone criticizing my choices. The terrace where I would sip coffee in silence. The bedroom with wide glass doors opening to the ocean, where I would finally sleep without a knot in my chest. It felt surreal, almost too good. Because for so long, I had lived in the shadow of their opinions. I remembered the countless conversations with my daughter where she parroted his words, telling me I needed to be more modern or trust him more, reminding me that I was lucky to have him manage things I didn't understand. It broke me quietly, hearing my own child doubt me because she believed in his power more than mine. And I accepted it, thinking love meant endurance, thinking motherhood meant swallowing your pride. But walking those hallways, hearing the crash of the waves just beyond the glass, I realized endurance had cost me decades, and this villa was the first thing I had done solely for myself. I poured a glass of wine, sat on the balcony, and looked out at the sea. My phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from him, from my daughter, from numbers I didn't recognize but knew were connected to him. Demands, accusations, manipulations. He was already weaving his net, trying to drag me back into his control. I set the phone down, face down, and let it buzz until the battery died. For the first time, their noise wasn't my problem. I had a deed with my name alone. I had the ocean as my witness. And I had the unshakable realization that I wasn't going back. Whatever storm was coming, I would face it on my terms, not theirs. The storm came quicker than I expected. Within days, my daughter called me in tears, her voice trembling, but not from grief. From anger planted by him. "Mom, how could you do this without telling us? We're family. You're making me look like a fool in front of everyone. People think you don't trust us. Do you know what that does to me?" Her words were sharp, but they weren't hers. I could hear him behind every syllable, feeding her the script, coaching her to make me doubt myself. For a moment, I wanted to crumble. I wanted to explain, to reassure her, to beg her to see that this wasn't against her, it was for me. But then I remembered every time she chose his comfort over my dignity, every time she stood silently when he belittled me, every time she allowed him to dip into my savings, insisting it was temporary. Love had blinded me, but love was no longer an excuse. So I stayed calm. "This house is mine. It's not up for debate," I said. She gasped, as if I had struck her, then hissed back, You're being manipulated by strangers, Mom. You're going to ruin yourself. You're going to end up alone. Alone. The word should have scared me, but instead it lit something inside me. Alone meant free from their demands, free from their endless appetite, free from the weight of being everyone's safety net. I could hear the phone shift hands then, his voice sliding in smooth, controlled. You're dividing this family, and for what? A house you'll be buried in? Don't do this the hard way. Sign it over now and avoid what's coming. We'll handle the paperwork. His confidence made me smile, a quiet, private smile. Because while he was threatening, I was preparing. I had already hired a lawyer, already secured my finances, already put protections in place that made the villa untouchable. I had learned from him. Learned that power lies not in words, but in documentation, in preparation, in acting before the enemy even knows the game has begun. He thought he could corner me, but he didn't realize the walls were already built. I hung up without another word. And as the sun dipped below the horizon that night, I felt something shift forever. This was no longer about a house. This was about finally severing the chain they had wrapped around me for years. And I knew. They were about to discover what it meant to underestimate me. He came to the villa 2 days later, not with threats over the phone, but with a smile like he'd invited himself to lunch. The kind of smile that pretends to care while sizing up every chair in the room. He rang the bell and I let him in. My heart did not leap. It steadied, measured, the way someone who's practiced a move does before they strike. He stepped into the foyer, eyes scanning the art, the windows, the way light fell on the marble, as if he were already calculating how to decorate it in his taste. Isn't it beautiful? I said and watched the muscles in his face twitch. He offered a practiced, oily compliment. It suits you, Mom. Really? He said the words like a snake offering a garland. He assumed his presence would rearrange the room the way it had once rearranged my life. Subtle, invasive, inevitable. I led him to the terrace and poured tea. The gardeners were there, the poolman was tidying the planters, and the housekeeper was at ease in the kitchen. The place hummed with competent paid hands, not the chaotic love of freeloaders. He walked the rooms with that condescending air, and I let him because I wanted him to keep talking. He talked about logistics, security, taxes, peace of mind if he was involved. And all the while I watched him. I watched the way his eyes lingered on the safe room I'd had built into the study, the way his fingers brushed a shelf where I kept a slim folder of documents, receipts, and a list of every time his family had taken from me. He laughed at his own jokes, as if the world were his audience, not realizing I had already invited witnesses to his performance. Midway through his tour, I asked casually, "Do you remember the renovations on your mother's house in 2018? He stopped, smile thinning. "Yes, why?" he said. I reached into my bag and set an envelope on the coffee table. "Because I found a receipt the other day," I said. "For $80,000 transferred from your account to a contractor you said was a friend." His expression shuddered for a second. "That was for—" he stammered, then steadied with that practiced spin of blame. Before he could pin a narrative to it, I continued. "And I found the email chain where you promised to return the money by June 2019. That never happened. But I kept the receipts." He heard the ledger, the tally, the slow click of things adding up against him. He moved from confident to cautious in a heartbeat. That's when I started handing him the camera. Not literally. I had the house's security footage playing on a discreet tablet, a timeline of small betrayals. Christmas parties paid with my card, borrowed furniture never returned, a wire transfer labeled temporary that disappeared into an offshore account. I named dates, amounts, vendors. March 12, 2017, $4,200 to Seaside Renovations. November 3, 2019, $2,500 labeled event deposit. The bank transfer on August 8, 2020, $32,000 to a company tied to his partner. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. He tried to laugh it off. "You misunderstand. You're reading old files out of context. But context only matters when facts don't sit heavy on a table." I told him I had copies sent to my lawyer that morning, and that they'd already been cataloged and time-stamped. I watched the color drain from his face in real time, a slow sun setting behind him. Then I offered him something he did not anticipate, a path that would make the humiliation public but quick, or quiet and clean but final. He asked what I meant, and I said, "You can choose to return what you took, sign a formal acknowledgement that you used my funds without consent, and we can keep this private. Or I can file it, and the bank subpoenas will bring everything into the light. He laughed at first, a sharp, disbelieving sound. Then his smile dissolved. "You can't do that," he said. "There are reputations to protect." Reputations. The word tasted like iron. Reputation is a story told by people who fear consequences, I said. I prefer facts. He put his hands in his pockets, a small, ridiculous attempt at nonchalance. You don't want to ruin your daughter. Think about her. I looked at him, at the man who had taught my child to put his comfort before my dignity, and I thought about the nights she'd sat in my kitchen, phone clutched, repeating his versions of events until she no longer used her own voice. My daughter is not the issue, I said softly. You are. For the first time, he looked small. Not because of the house, not because of the ocean, but because the ledger had shrunk a man used to hiding behind words into someone who had to account for numbers. He tried to bargain, a payment plan, a promise, legal maneuvers. But I had already anticipated every detour. I had a trust in place that made the villa inaccessible in the ways he expected to access it. I had bank holds on accounts. I had a notarized letter allocating emergency funds to independent trustees. Every move he could make to seize power had been countered with documentation. He kept pushing because people like him habitually keep pushing until something breaks. What broke was his certainty. The next morning, there was a letter on his desk at the firm, a polite notice from my attorney demanding a meeting to discuss restitution and formal acknowledgement of debt. The firm called, the secretary's voice careful, and I heard him curse under his breath like a man discovering a leak in a ship he thought unsinkable. He frantically called my daughter, trying to spin the narrative to paint me as a villain for bringing legal pressure into a home. She cried. He held the phone like a weapon. But between his calls, between his rounds of damage control, other people began to speak. A cousin he'd leaned on for favors reached out to me privately and verified a line item I'd suspected. The contractor he'd used confessed to being paid directly from his account as a favor, not for work on my property. Each confirmation was a stitch, sewing a case tight. I didn't celebrate. This wasn't about vengeance that looked like glee. It was about rectifying an account long overdue. I moved deliberate pieces. Letters to the bank, copies of contracts, a clear public notice should we need it, and the carefully worded option presented to him and my daughter: restitution, signed apology, and a public acknowledgement that they had taken from me, or I would proceed with disclosures. I watched the dynamic shift. Where there had been arrogance, now there was calculation. Where there had been assumed access, now there were locks, signatures, and deadlines. He tried every last maneuver. Gaslighting, offers of help, threats of estrangement. Each was met with firm, documented countermeasures. And as their campaign of social pressure ramped up, a smear here, a manipulative text there, people who knew the truth began to ask questions. An editor of the local society column, who'd once accepted his family philanthropy spin, called to verify a donation. An old friend who'd witnessed his borrowing decades ago confirmed it privately. The ledger did its work. It turned rumor into record and record into consequence. The true revenge, the one that felt righteous and clean, wasn't in humiliating them in public. It was in the small procedural victories, the bank freezing contested accounts, the contractor admitting to the paper trail, the lawyer drafting a settlement that required him to account for every numbered invoice. Each tiny bureaucratic win was a boundary reinforced, a little corner reclaimed. I stopped answering calls sometimes, not out of fear, but out of strategy. I let their guilt sow itself and watched how quickly it became their own undoing. I attended one mediation meeting with a quiet folder of dates and sums, and a resolve that surprised even me with its calmness. He arrived with a lawyer and a face full of bravado. He left with a binding agreement that returned funds and required public acknowledgement. My daughter read the agreement and wept, not because of shame, but because the truth had anchored into something she could see in black and white. She apologized, halting and fragile, and I listened. It wasn't a Hollywood unmasking with a villain kneeling in the rain, but a slow, legal, meticulous rebalancing of debts and dignity. When the final settlement was signed, I stood on the terrace, the ocean wide and indifferent, and thought of all the small exits I'd once taken to preserve a family facade. The villa, once the spark that ignited the storm, had become the safe harbor I'd always needed. They had tried to make it a battleground to keep me small. Instead, it was the place where I wrote the final invoices of my life on my terms. Yet the story didn't end there. People had seen how I had turned quiet savings into a fortress, and murmurs began to travel in the family circles where I'd once been invisible. She's changed, some said, with envy wrapped in old scorn. She's become difficult. And to those who whispered, I would say later, when asked, difficult is simply someone who no longer accepts being diminished. The villa remained mine, not because of its marble or view, but because it proved a point none of them could argue against. I had a right to choose for myself, and I had the will to protect that choice. He tried one last time, weeks after the settlement had been signed, when the ink was dry and the numbers could no longer be twisted. He showed up unannounced at the villa, his car parked deliberately in full view of the neighbors, as if to suggest he still had some claim here. He wore that same forced smile, but I could see the desperation etched around his eyes, the kind of lines arrogance can't hide forever. He stood on my terrace, looking out at the horizon, and said softly, "You don't have to do this alone. We can start over. Forget all of this. Put the past behind us." His words were carefully chosen, but I heard what he really meant. Undo it. Let me back in, pretend you never drew the line. I walked him through the foyer, the marble cool beneath my steps, and I felt the weight of the house itself at my back. A silent ally, a monument to the fact that I had survived and rebuilt. "There's nothing to start over from," I told him. "The past isn't behind us. It's documented, signed, acknowledged. It belongs to you now, not me." His smirk faltered for the last time because he realized he no longer had leverage. I wasn't fighting him anymore. I wasn't defending myself. I had already won. He muttered something about family, about how I would regret pushing my daughter away, about how money couldn't buy love. And I let him speak because none of it mattered anymore. Love doesn't demand silence. Family doesn't demand obedience. And money. Money had simply bought me the freedom to see the truth without flinching. When he finally left, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. I closed the door quietly behind him and felt a silence fill the house that wasn't empty, but full. Full of my own voice, my own presence, my own power. The villa became more than a home. It was proof that survival can transform into sovereignty, that boundaries can be the greatest revenge, and that sometimes the most radical act a woman can commit is to refuse to be managed by anyone else ever again. Standing on the terrace that night, the ocean endless and unbothered, I whispered to myself words he would never understand. I am not your resource. I am not your safety net. I am not yours. And for the first time in my life, those words were enough. Standing on the terrace that night, the ocean endless and unbothered, I whispered to myself words he would never understand. I am not your resource. I am not your safety net. I am not yours. And for the first time in my life, those words were enough. But tell me, do you think I went too far or not far enough? Would you have done the same in my place? Let me know in the comments.